Yet again, Cathar Love 74, Labyrinth. Well, imagine my surprise. Actually, I was sitting with Monica the other night, and we'd had our evening meal. I cooked it. I'm not a bad cook, actually. And let's begin at the beginning. Cathar Love 74, Labyrinth. So, once again into the fray. Having cooked the meal, actually I had lamb steak, and I had marinated it in turmeric, dry ginger, and yogurt, pepper of course, and some fish sauce. So I did that before I actually stir fried it, and then I had it with eggplant and mushrooms and Chinese broccoli. So very tasty. Now, Labyrinth. Having enjoyed our meal, we were sitting, and I heard Cathar, and I went, oh, on the TV. And here was this second episode of this television movie, Labyrinth. So I hadn't seen the first one. So it was a matter of picking up the pieces. And suddenly there was Simon de Montfort on the scene, and the Cathars, and there was a photograph of a shot of Montsegur, and they were talking about the Grail and how they're trying to protect the Grail from the crusading knights. Oh, wow. So the thing that struck me was, one, it was bringing publicity about the Cathars. It was bringing publicity about the fact that the Cathars had a Grail, although here John Hurt, wonderful actor, he's talking about the Grail being some metaphorical thing, or it's something within each of us. But the Cathar has a Grail, and the Cathar Grail is to do with both rituals of both birth and living. Cathars weren't great into having children. Catharism was about you, but they still use this silver Grail, and it's in one piece. It can't be separated, and it's silver. And even though it's true, the crusading knights from the north and that they wanted to destroy anything and everything that was to do with Catharism, and of course he was the Grail. It was also a part of their rituals, and they had very few rituals, and they didn't have churches, caves and the forests and homes, but they did have this Grail, and it was a centerpiece of their within the Grail situation, and they wanted it destroyed, and of course it hasn't been destroyed, and it hasn't been found either. So the Grail, as far as the Cathars are concerned, is a real thing. The other thing, it had Simon de Montfort. Now, I'd like to say a few words about Simon de Montfort, because people get, oh, Simon de Montfort, yes, the Magna Carta. He was one of the barons that revolted against King Henry III of England, and they started parliamentary democracy because this was the Magna Carta. But this was that would have been Simon de Montfort, one of the Crusaders against the Albigensians, against the Cathars. Well, he was the 5th Earl of Leicester, and the Simon de Montfort would be his son, and would be the 6th Earl of Leicester. And Simon de Montfort, the 5th Earl, he was a good soldier, but he was pretty cruel, and he burnt at Minerve 143 Cathars, and then he was besieging a small village, and he'd already won a battle. He had these prisoners, something around about 100 prisoners, and so what he did was he cut off their ears, their nose and their lips and blinded them, and he sent them into this village and as a warning, and he had the leading one, he allowed him one eye so that he could lead the other 100 in there. So he was he had a cruel streak, and so this was part of it, and part of the story was also Raymond Roger Trinqueval, who was, some people say he was in the Grail stories, he's put down sometimes as Percival, the knight, one of the knights, Percival. Be as it may, he was a young gallant knight, and he was in charge of Carcasonne, and he realised that he couldn't parley, he couldn't come to any agreement with Simon de Montfort, so he came back, and the Carcasonne was besieged, but they ran out of water. So he approached Simon de Montfort under a flag of truce, and this is supposed to be the age of chivalry. And Simon de Montfort, obviously they had to disarm themselves, and he immediately took him prisoner and threw him into a dungeon where he died either of dysentery, but more likely was poisoned. But in this movie, Simon de Montfort put a rope around his neck and garroted him. So that was a new one to me. But so I remember once there was that Aussie actor and Gibson, Mel Gibson, and he did Braveheart. Was about the Braveheart, the famous Scots rebel, and he was supposed to have fallen in love with this French princess. And the trouble is that he died before the French princess was born. And anyhow, when this historical fact was brought to Mel Gibson, and Mel Gibson said, "Well," he said, we can't let the history get in the road of a good story." So in this telling movie, one could say the same thing. They didn't let history get in the way of a good story. And one of the things that struck me was when Montsegur was besieged, and it was besieged for 10 months. And eventually they capitulated and surrendered. And the 240 Cathars, we've gone into it before, the massacre of Montsegur, and they were burnt. Now, what it appears from what I can gather, and that's also a medium friend of mine, and the Cathars, the crusading knights gave the Cathars 2 weeks, which they asked for, but that also gave the crusaders time to chop down the trees, and they made a large circular palisade. But some people feel they were thrown over this palisade, or they were made to walk into it, but it would appear that one section of the palisade was kept open, and they lit this fire because, as I am made aware, that it was Bertram Marty who was the head. He was a tall Cathar. He was the leader of the Cathars, and they made an example of him, and he had to walk into the flames, and he was the first one to walk in, which he did. So regarding that, in the movie they had Cathars. They could see the flames there, and the Cathars were moving towards it, and they were walked into the flames. But in actual fact, the knights, they had horses, or there were knights on horseback, and they just were herding the people into the flames. So again, this it means the palisade must have had an opening. But the thing about this telling movie is that the Cathars were carrying crosses. Now, the one thing the Cathars wouldn't be carrying is a cross. The Cathars abhorred the cross, the crucifix. They had logic to their argument. They said, look, if your father was hung with a rope, would you worship that rope? If you were stabbed with a dagger, would you be holding up that dagger in reverence? You know, if someone blew your father or mother's brains out with a pistol, would you be saying, oh, look at this pistol, and giving reverence to it? So they said, why are you giving any reverence to a cross that the Saviour was crucified on? They said, that's a joke. So they had no time for the cross. They had no time for baptism. I mean, what does a baby know about baptism? They can't even spell the word, and you're expecting, and you're turning it into a Christian or whatever. Marriage was the same thing. You know, you were just herded like cattle. You were bought like cattle and so forth. What's marriage? That marriage in those days, medieval marriage, got to do with love, and love was what they were about. How you treated another person was what they were about. How you respected another person was what you were about. How you didn't do harm to another person was what the Cathars were about. Not getting into power and material things. This is what the Cathars were about. And this is what basically Catharism is about today. So the Labyrinth, and the name, I possibly, because in the south of France, because of it's a limestone area and the water that's gone through, and there's thousands and thousands of caves, and some of the earliest cave paintings are discovered in the south of France amongst these limestone caves. And there's a lot of, and of course there's many limestone caves that are yet to be discovered. So I presume the labyrinth is referring to the labyrinth of caves in there. Interesting thing about Montsegur is that because people were up there for quite a long time, they lived up there, and once they knew this was their refuge, and people died there for various reasons, but they've never found where the people were buried. I think that only they've discovered two skeletons together, and I think that's about the only remains of the dead that they found in Montsegur. So obviously there's some cave somewhere where they inter the remains, which is yet to be found. So the labyrinth, I enjoyed it so much, but more from coming from a Cathar point of view, because the whole basis of the story was about reincarnation, how this person who was at the time was a Cathar at the time of the Cathars was reincarnated into this present, into contemporary times, and how the stories entwined, and this gave the chance to discuss the Cathars and John Hurt in his impeccable tones, wonderful actor, certainly an amazing speaking voice. I wish I had his speaking voice. And he gave weight to the Cathar story when he did speak. His dying scenes were a bit much, but anyway. So it brought in various aspects and concepts of Catharism, of reincarnation, and my partner Monica mentioned, she said, you know, that there's reincarnation and things like this. There just wouldn't be Catharism. There just wouldn't be anything, certainly on a movie, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. So there is this resurgence when you can make a mainstream movie and you can bring in the Cathars and you can bring in reincarnation and things like this, and you're still going to expect an audience. Therefore, they must have done their homework, and they must know that people are intrigued, even if they don't believe. But according to the polls, you know, there's something like, well, I can remember when Gallup first, the Gallup poll, he started that in the 30s, in 1935 or whatever it was, And at that time, there was only something like about 28% of people believed in reincarnation. And yet, 1 or 2 years ago, when they did the same poll, it's up in the 70 and 80% of people now believe in reincarnation. So it's just the mountain of evidence, empirical evidence, that's there, that's in front of you. So, so here we have it, Labyrinth, and it's bringing it's about the Cathars and reincarnation, the Cathar story. It showed the massacre of the Cathars. It brought in Simon de Montfort, Raymond Roger Tranqueville, the knight, and so they took history and they took things that were historical facts and mixed them with a little historical fiction, and altogether made an interesting story. So I certainly enjoyed it for what it was. And so we have the Labyrinth, and I just think it's a reflection of the fact that Catharism is coming back in. People are interested, and if they weren't, they certainly wouldn't be bringing in a movie which brings in these concepts. So, if you haven't seen it, look out for it. Bye for now.